You're settling in now, maybe under a blanket, maybe staring at the ceiling, and I'm here with you. Welcome to Tales of Vatican Secrets. If this is your first time hearing my voice, I hope you'll stay a while, maybe even subscribe if the story pulls you in. I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Because what we're about to walk through together isn't some vague mystery about shadows and whispers. This is about a real file, a real decision made by real people inside the Vatican's archival system and the specific institutional mechanisms that kept certain documents locked away instead of destroyed. Once we start moving through the catalog codes, the restriction classifications, the physical rooms where these decisions were made, there's no stepping back to comfortable ignorance. You'll know exactly how silence was engineered and why some records were considered more dangerous preserved than erased. You're standing now in the mind's eye at the entrance to the Vatican Secret Archives, though that name changed officially in 2019 to the Vatican Apostolic Archives, a rebranding that did nothing to alter the physical reality of what exists inside. And you need to understand something fundamental before we go further. This is not a library where you walk in and browse. The Vatican archival system operates under the Scudario, a catalog structure that dates back to reorganizations in the late 19th century under Leo XIII, specifically after 1881 when he opened portions of the archives to qualified scholars for the first time in a systematic way. The Scudario is a card-based index system, though now partially digitized, that categorizes documents not by subject in the way a modern researcher might expect, but by fondo, archival groups tied to the administrative origin of the document. When you request access, and you must request access through a formal application process that requires institutional affiliation and a specific research question, you're not asking to see Inquisition records broadly. You're asking for a precise fondo designation, like the Sanctum Officium holdings from a specific decade. What makes this relevant to our story is that within this system there exists a classification tier that most people never encounter. The Riservato designation, which marks a document as restricted beyond the standard 100-year rule that applies to papal correspondence. A Riservato file isn't necessarily explosive or scandalous in content. It's marked restricted because of institutional sensitivity, which could mean anything from ongoing diplomatic implications to the involvement of living persons or their immediate descendants, or because the document touches on internal Vatican administrative processes that the Holy See considers outside the scope of historical inquiry. The file we're concerned with tonight was locked under a Riservato classification in 1957, during the final years of Pius X's papacy, a period when the Vatican was still processing the enormous archival backlog from World War II and simultaneously navigating the early Cold War's ideological battlegrounds. The decision to lock, rather than destroy this particular file, and we'll get to its contents, I promise, was made by Monsignor Angelo Mercati, who served as the prefect of the Vatican Archives from 1925 until his death in 1955, though the classification itself was implemented by his immediate successor. Mercati had developed a philosophy about preservation that bordered on obsessive. He believed that destruction of documents, even embarrassing or politically inconvenient ones, represented a form of institutional amnesia that would eventually harm the Church more than transparency ever could. But Mercati also understood that transparency had to be controlled, metered, released only when the living consequences of revelation had diminished to historical footnotes. So, he pioneered, informally at first and then as codified practice, a middle path. Documents that might otherwise have been destroyed were instead locked under restriction classifications so severe that they functionally ceased to exist for contemporary scholarship. But they remained physically intact in the archives. The Vatican's physical storage system for these Riservato files involves a series of climate-controlled strong rooms in the basement levels of the archive building, behind doors that require not just key access, but logged authorization from the prefect's office. These aren't vault doors in the Hollywood sense. Their reinforced steel doors painted the same institutional beige as every other door in the complex, marked only with alphanumeric codes that correspond to the fondo and sub-fondo classifications inside. The file in question tonight, which we'll call by its catalog designation RSV Hohenzollern's 1957-34, sits in one of these rooms, in an acid-free archival box on a steel shelf, surrounded by hundreds of other boxes containing everything from medieval land disputes to 20th century diplomatic cables. The consequence of this system, and this is where we start to see the real architecture of institutional silence, is that historians who know these files exist, and some do through fragmentary references in accessible documents, can't request them. The request itself is denied at the administrative level before it ever reaches the prefect for consideration. This creates a strange secondary archive of ghost documents, records that appear in footnotes and indexes but remain perpetually inaccessible, shaping historical understanding through their absence rather than their presence. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this system represents responsible stewardship or a form of soft censorship, and that disagreement has grown sharper since 2019, when Pope Francis opened portions of the Pius XIII archives earlier than the standard 100-year rule would have required. That opening, which made front-page news in academic circles, released thousands of documents related to the Vatican's wartime diplomacy and Pius XII's controversial silence regarding the Holocaust. But RSV 1957-34 was not among the released files. It remained locked, its reservado status reaffirmed by current archival administration, which suggests that whatever it contains is considered more sensitive now, in the 21st century, than documents directly addressing the Church's most scrutinized moral failure of the modern era. The physical document itself, according to the archival inventory that is accessible, consists of 47 pages of typed correspondence in Italian, with handwritten marginalia in what archival notes describe as multiple hands, suggesting circulation among several Vatican officials. The correspondence dates from March to November 1957, and the primary author is identified in the inventory only by initials M.G., which is itself unusual because Vatican document inventories typically include full names unless the author held a position sensitive enough to warrant abbreviated identification even in internal records. The catalog entry notes that the file includes related memoranda without specifying how many or from whom, and lists the subject classification as administrative procedure, financial oversight, which is Vatican archival code language for documents involving money moving through church institutions in ways that required internal investigation or review. Now here's where the historical anchor becomes important. 1957 was not a quiet year for Vatican finances. This was the period immediately following the establishment of the Istituto per le Opere di Religione in its modern form. The Vatican Bank, though it's not technically a bank under the management of Bernardino Nogara's successors. Nogara himself, who had revolutionized Vatican finances from 1929 until his retirement in 1954, had died in 1958, just months after the correspondence in our file ceased. The Vatican Bank had been created originally in 1942, but underwent significant structural reorganization in the mid-1950s as post-war Italy's economy boomed and the Church found itself managing substantial real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and international financial flows that didn't fit neatly into traditional ecclesiastical accounting. The administrative machinery for oversight was improvised, inconsistent, and vulnerable to exactly the kind of irregularities that would require internal investigation. You're beginning to see now that the decision to lock this file rather than destroy it wasn't arbitrary. It was the product of a specific institutional moment when the Vatican was caught between its traditional opacity and the growing pressure for financial accountability, even if that accountability was purely internal. Let's go deeper into the physical reality of what that meant. Inside the Vatican's administrative structure in the 1950s, financial oversight was divided among several offices that didn't always communicate effectively with each other. The Amministrazione del Patrimonio della Sede Apostolica, known by its Italian acronym APSE, managed the Holy See's real estate and investment holdings. The Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Vatican Bank we mentioned, handled accounts for religious orders, clergy, and Vatican employees, but also served as a conduit for international financial transactions that needed to move through Vatican City's unusual legal status as a sovereign entity. And then there was the Governatorato, the administrative body that managed Vatican City State's daily operations, including everything from postage to utilities to payroll. In 1957, a routine audit, routine in the sense that it was scheduled, not in the sense that it was casual, discovered a discrepancy in accounts related to a property transaction involving a Vatican-owned building in Rome's Prati district, just across the Tiber from Vatican City proper. The building, acquired in the early 1950s as part of the Vatican's expansion of its Roman real estate portfolio, had been leased to a private firm whose rent payments were supposed to flow through APSA's accounting, but had instead been deposited into an account at the Vatican Bank that wasn't properly documented in either institution's primary ledgers. The amount wasn't enormous by the standards of Vatican finances. The inventory notes reference funds in the range of several hundred million lire, which in 1957 dollars would have been somewhere between 1 and 200,000, significant but not catastrophic. What made the discrepancy alarming wasn't the amount, but the mechanism. Someone inside the Vatican's financial administration had created what modern accounting would call a shadow account, a place where money could sit without appearing in the standard audit trail. The investigation that followed, which is what generated the correspondence in RSV Cubon's 1957-34, was handled not by external auditors, but by a small internal committee assembled quietly by the Secretary of State's office. This is important because it tells us the Vatican recognized immediately that the problem wasn't just technical accounting irregularity, but potential scandal if it became public. The committee included a canon lawyer, a financial administrator from APSA, and a senior official from the Secretariat of State, whose role was essentially to assess the political and reputational risk of various possible responses. The correspondence in the file represents their back and forth over 8 months as they tried to determine whether the shadow account was the result of bureaucratic confusion, a private arrangement by a single corrupt official, or something more systematic. What they discovered, and this is where the file's contents become genuinely sensitive even decades later, was that the shadow account wasn't unique. The audit trail, once they started pulling at the thread, revealed at least 3 other similar accounts, connected to different property transactions in Rome and Milan, all dating from the early to mid-1950s, all involving Vatican-owned real estate leased to private entities, and all showing the same pattern: rent payments that should have been visible in APSA's books were instead sitting in undocumented Vatican bank accounts. The total amount across all accounts was substantial enough that one of the marginalia notes in the file, visible in the archival inventory's description, includes the phrase "total non trascurabile," not negligible total. The specific mechanism that allowed this to happen was a quirk in how Vatican bank accounts were structured. Because the bank served multiple functions, acting as both a personal bank for clergy and religious orders, and as a financial services provider for Vatican administrative offices, it was possible to open an account without the level of documentation that would be required in a secular banking system. An account could be opened with simply a letter of authorization from a senior Vatican official, and as long as deposits and withdrawals happened within the bank's internal systems, they didn't necessarily appear in the consolidated financial reports that APSA used for its oversight. This wasn't a designed loophole so much as an architectural flaw in how the Vatican's financial institutions had evolved separately without integrated oversight. The investigation committee's correspondence, according to later references that have leaked into academic literature through informal conversations with Vatican archivists, reveals significant disagreement among the three members about how to proceed. The canon lawyer apparently argued for a formal proceeding that would identify the individuals responsible and impose canonical penalties, which would create an official record and establish precedent for future cases. The APSE financial administrator argued for a quiet resolution that would close the shadow accounts, transfer the funds to proper ledgers, and tighten the procedures for opening new accounts without creating any official record that would suggest the problem had been serious. And the Secretariat of State official, whose primary concern was protecting the Vatican's reputation during a period when it was already facing criticism over Pius XIII's wartime record and needed to maintain its moral authority during the Cold War, argued for something more drastic, that the individuals responsible should be quietly reassigned or retired, the accounts closed and their contents absorbed into general Vatican funds without detailed accounting, and all documentation of the investigation sealed under indefinite restriction. You're past the point now where this feels like distant history. You're inside the machinery of institutional decision-making, watching how the choice to lock rather than destroy was really a choice about what kind of institution the Vatican wanted to be. The decision, made in late 1957, followed the Secretariat of State officials' recommendation, but with one crucial modification insisted upon by Monsignor Mercati's successor as prefect of the Vatican Archives. The documentation would not be destroyed. Every page of correspondence, every memorandum, every financial record related to the shadow accounts would be preserved, cataloged, and placed under riservato restriction with no specified end date. The logic, as expressed in a brief memo that does appear in accessible Vatican administrative files from that period, was that destroying the documents would make it impossible for future church leadership to learn from the institutional failures that had allowed the irregularities to occur, and would also eliminate any possibility of future accountability if circumstances changed. But the restriction would ensure that the scandal couldn't be exploited by the Church's enemies during a sensitive geopolitical period. This compromise satisfied everyone on the committee for different reasons. The canon lawyer felt that preservation maintained some thread of accountability. The APSA administrator got his quiet resolution without formal proceedings, and the Secretariat of State official achieved his primary goal of preventing public scandal. The physical process of sealing the file was straightforward but deliberate. The documents were removed from their original administrative folders, where they would have been accessible to Vatican officials with routine clearances, and placed into a new archival box with a riservato catalog designation. The box was then logged into the restricted materials inventory, which is itself a restricted document but not classified at the same level. Researchers can see that RSV Durstein 1957-34 exists. They just can't access it or learn details beyond the bare catalog description. The box was placed in Strong Room 7, which in the archive's basement geography is located in the oldest section of the underground storage complex, in a corridor that requires two separate locked doors to access, and that houses primarily 19th and early 20th century restricted materials. The choice of location was significant. By placing a 1957 document in the physical space reserved for much older restricted materials, the archivists were essentially treating it as if it were already historical, already removed from contemporary relevance, even though the events it described had concluded mere months earlier. This spatial distancing is a subtle form of institutional forgetting. The file exists, but it exists in a place that suggests it's less urgent, less immediate than its actual vintage would indicate. Now, the consequence of this decision has rippled through Vatican financial reforms in ways that most historians studying those reforms don't fully recognize. In the decades after 1957, the Vatican implemented multiple waves of financial oversight reform, particularly following the scandals of the 1980s involving Archbishop Paul Marcinkus and the Vatican Bank's entanglement with Roberto Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano collapse. Each reform was presented as unprecedented, as a fundamental shift toward transparency and accountability, and each reform did implement real structural changes. The creation of the Ufficio del Revisore Generale in the early 1980s, the establishment of the Autorità di Informazione Finanziaria in 2010, to comply with international money laundering standards, and most recently Pope Francis's creation of the Segreteria per l'Economia in 2014 to centralize financial oversight. But because the 1957 investigation remained locked, because its findings and the institutional mechanisms it revealed were never incorporated into the institutional memory available to reformers, each wave of reform essentially rediscovered the same structural vulnerabilities that had enabled the 1957 irregularities. The lack of integrated oversight between APSA and the Vatican Bank, the ability to open accounts without adequate documentation, the absence of clear audit trails for property-related transactions. These issues persisted through the decades because the specific historical precedent that would have made their urgency clear remained sealed. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this pattern represents genuine institutional amnesia or a more deliberate maintenance of plausible deniability. And that disagreement cuts to the heart of how we understand Vatican governance. The Vatican's institutional culture has long valued continuity and stability over rupture and reform, which means that acknowledging past failures in official documents creates pressure for accountability that can destabilize existing power structures. By locking rather than destroying RSV Chartutuans, 1957.34, the Vatican created a perfect liminal state. The document existed for future internal reference if church leadership ever chose to learn from it, but it didn't exist for the public record or for historians who might use it to demand accountability or to contextualize later scandals. In the archives themselves, there's a widely known but rarely discussed phenomenon that archivists call catalog orphans, documents that appear in the index, but are marked with restrictions so absolute that they've become functionally inaccessible even to Vatican researchers. RSV Tuolin, 1957-34, is one of several hundred such documents created during the 20th century, a period when the Vatican faced repeated crises that generated documentation the institution wanted preserved but not revealed. These orphans create a shadow history of the modern church, a history that exists in physical form but not in accessible narrative. When Pope Francis announced the early opening of the Pius X archives in 2019, there was significant scholarly excitement that some of these orphan documents might be included in the release, that the Vatican was finally moving toward a more comprehensive transparency. The reality was more limited. The release focused narrowly on documents related to World War II diplomacy and the Holocaust, documents that were certainly significant and that did reshape some scholarly understanding of Pius' actions and motivations, but the release was carefully curated. Documents like RSV Tuas 1957-134, which touched on financial rather than diplomatic matters, which revealed institutional rather than individual failures, and which had implications for ongoing Vatican financial operations, remained locked. The decision to maintain that restriction tells us something about what the Vatican considers more dangerous. It's more willing to confront, at least partially, its moral failures during the Holocaust than to open its financial machinery to historical scrutiny. You're deep enough now that the texture of this silence should feel concrete, not mysterious. You should be understanding not just that a file was locked, but exactly how the locking mechanism worked and why it's proven so durable across decades of institutional change. Let's follow the thread further into the specific individuals whose names appear in the accessible portions of the Vatican's administrative records from this period, because understanding who made these decisions and under what pressures gives us the human dimension of institutional secrecy. The Secretariat of State official who argued most forcefully for sealing the 1957 investigation was almost certainly Domenico Tardini, who served as Pro-Secretary of State under Pius XV from 1952 until the Pope's death in 1958, when John XXIII appointed him as full Secretary of State. Tardini was a protégé of Eugenio Pacelli, Pius XIII's given name, and had been deeply involved in the Vatican's wartime diplomacy, which made him particularly sensitive to reputational risk and particularly committed to protecting the institutional church from external criticism. His approach to Vatican governance emphasized confidentiality and hierarchy, the principle that information should be shared only on a strict need-to-know basis, and that decisions should be made by a small circle of trusted officials, rather than through transparent processes. This wasn't unusual for Vatican administration in the 1950s. It was essentially the default mode, but Tardini was especially systematic in applying it. When the 1957 financial irregularities came to light, Tardini's immediate instinct was to contain the information within the smallest possible circle and to ensure that resolution happened without creating documentation that could later be used against the Church. The fact that he ultimately accepted the compromise of preservation under restriction rather than destruction suggests he was overruled or persuaded by someone whose authority he couldn't ignore, most likely Pius XIII himself. Pius XIII had a complex relationship with institutional transparency. He was personally scrupulous about financial matters and had supported Bernardino Nogara's efforts to professionalize Vatican finances during the 1930s and 1940s. But he was also deeply concerned with maintaining the Vatican's moral authority and believed that public acknowledgement of internal failures undermined that authority. The compromise of sealing rather than destroying may have represented his own internal tension, a desire to maintain accountability within the institution while preventing external exploitation of church weaknesses. After Pius XV's death in October 1958, just months after the file was sealed, the entire dynamic shifted. John XXIII, who succeeded him, brought a dramatically different governing philosophy. John XXIII's papacy is remembered primarily for calling the Second Vatican Council, which revolutionized the Church's relationship with modernity and transparency. But his impact on Vatican financial administration is less well known. Within months of his election, he initiated a review of Vatican financial procedures, not because he knew about the 1957 irregularities specifically, but because he had heard enough rumors and complaints during his years as a Vatican diplomat to suspect that the financial system needed serious reform. He appointed a commission to study the question, and that commission's work eventually led to some of the first systematic financial controls implemented in the early 1960s. But notably, the Commission was not given access to RSV Tetsu 1957-34. The restriction had been imposed by the previous papacy, and the institutional machinery of the Secretariat of State, still led by Tardini in the early years of John XXIII's reign, maintained that the document was sealed for good reason and that reopening it would serve no purpose since the specific irregularities had been resolved. This is where we see the real power of the riservato classification. Once imposed, it creates its own inertia. Even a reformist pope found it difficult to override the restriction without specific cause and without knowing the detailed contents of the file. He couldn't assess whether it contained information relevant to his reform efforts. The document effectively removed itself from the institutional conversation. The physical security of the file during this period also tells us something important. Strong Room 7, where the file was stored, was not widely accessible. In the 1960s, the Vatican archives were still operating under procedures that dated back to the 19th century, with limited staff and limited hours. The strong rooms were opened only when specific documents needed to be retrieved for authorized research, and research on 20th century materials was heavily restricted even before the riservato classification came into play. The practical result was that RSV 1957 could sit untouched for years at a time, not because anyone was actively preventing access, but because the normal rhythms of archival work simply didn't bring researchers or staff into Strong Room 7 to handle recent financial documents. This passive security, security through obscurity, and lack of routine access, rather than through active monitoring, is characteristic of how Vatican secrets have historically been maintained. It's not a conspiracy so much as institutional structure, doing the work of suppression, without anyone needing to actively suppress. Now, fast forward to the 1980s, when the Vatican bank scandal involving Archbishop Marcinkus became international news. Marcinkus, who served as president of the Vatican Bank from 1971 to 1989, became entangled with Roberto Calvi, the chairman of Italy's Banco Ambrosiano, in financial arrangements that eventually led to Calvi's death under suspicious circumstances in 1982, and the Banco Ambrosiano's collapse with $1.3 billion in debt, some of which was linked to Vatican Bank accounts. The scandal was massive, generating intense media coverage and serious questions about Vatican financial oversight. In the aftermath, Pope John Paul II initiated a series of reforms, including bringing in external auditors for the first time and creating new oversight structures. During this reform process, several Vatican officials with long institutional memory did suggest that the archives might contain relevant historical documents about financial oversight failures, and there were apparently informal conversations about reviewing restricted materials from the 1950s and 1960s to see if past precedents could inform current reforms. But these suggestions ran into the same institutional barrier. The riservato classification was still in effect, and lifting it would require the prefect of the archives to make a formal recommendation to the Secretary of State, who would then need to seek papal approval. The process was cumbersome enough, and the specific relevance of a 1957 document to 1980s problems was uncertain enough that the suggestion was dropped. RSV Haburtin 1957-34 remained locked, and the reforms proceeded without the benefit of its historical lessons. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this missed opportunity represents bureaucratic inefficiency or a more calculated decision by Vatican officials who preferred that the 1957 precedent remain buried, since acknowledging it would have raised uncomfortable questions about whether the structural vulnerabilities that enabled the 1957 irregularities had been allowed to persist for decades, enabling the Marcinkus scandal. You're at the end now, where all the threads we've followed converge into a single understanding. The file that was locked instead of destroyed represents not just one moment of institutional decision-making, but an entire system of how the Vatican manages its relationship with its own history. The choice to preserve RSV Toussaint 1957-34 under permanent restriction rather than destroying it reflects a deeply Catholic approach to sin and memory, the belief that erasure is itself a kind of sin, that the historical record must be maintained even when it's embarrassing or dangerous, but that the timing and manner of revelation must be controlled by institutional authority rather than by the demands of transparency or scholarship. This theological dimension of archival practice is rarely discussed explicitly, but it shapes every decision about what gets preserved, what gets restricted, and what gets released. The Vatican's archivists, many of whom are clergy or work closely with clerical oversight, operate within a framework where the archive is not just a repository of information, but a form of institutional memory that serves the Church's eternal mission, which means that immediate transparency can be subordinated to longer-term considerations about the Church's authority and effectiveness. In practical terms, this has created a two-tiered history of the modern Vatican: the history available to scholars and the public, which emphasizes the Church's spiritual mission, diplomatic achievements, and gradual adaptation to modernity, and the shadow history locked in restricted files like RSV Montezwoon 1957-34, which reveals the messier realities of institutional governance, financial management, and internal conflict. Neither history is false, but neither is complete without the other. The consequence for historical understanding is profound. When you read scholarly histories of Vatican finances or governance in the 20th century, you're reading accounts that are fundamentally incomplete, not because the historians are incompetent, but because the primary sources they need remain locked. This creates interpretive gaps that get filled with speculation, rumor, or ideologically driven assumptions. Critics of the Vatican assume the worst about what's hidden. Defenders assume the restrictions protect minor embarrassments rather than major scandals. And the truth sits in an acid-free box in Strong Room 7, accessible to no one. The Vatican's decision in 2019 to open the Pius XIII archives earlier than the standard 100-year rule raised hopes that the institution was moving toward greater transparency, but the careful curation of that release, including the continued restriction of financial documents like RSV 1957-34, suggests the shift is more limited than it initially appeared. The Vatican is willing to confront its moral history, at least partially, because that confrontation can be framed in spiritual terms of confession, learning, and growth. But it remains deeply resistant to opening its institutional machinery to external scrutiny, because that would threaten the mystique of Vatican governance and potentially empower critics who question the Church's temporal authority. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this resistance is sustainable in the long term, particularly as younger Vatican officials, more comfortable with transparency norms and more aware of how institutional secrecy fuels conspiracy theories and damages credibility, move into positions of authority. There are signs that the culture may be shifting. Pope Francis has personally intervened to declassify specific categories of documents, particularly related to financial reforms, and has publicly criticized the culture of secrecy within Vatican bureaucracy. But structural change happens slowly in an institution that measures time in centuries, and the Riservato classification system remains in place, protecting documents like RSV 1957-34 from access even as the Vatican publicly commits to greater transparency. The physical reality of the file's existence in Strong Room 7 has also become a kind of open secret within Vatican archival circles. Junior archivists working in the Vatican archives are aware of the restricted materials, even if they haven't accessed them. And some have spoken informally with scholars about the frustration of maintaining documents that no one can use. These conversations happen quietly, over coffee or during academic conferences, and they never result in leaks or unauthorized access because Vatican archivists take their responsibilities seriously and understand that violating confidentiality would end their careers and potentially expose them to canonical penalties. But the conversations reveal a growing tension between archival profession's commitment to access and the Vatican's institutional culture of restriction, a tension that will likely become more pronounced as generational turnover brings new perspectives into the archives. For now, RSV 1957-34 remains locked, will likely remain locked for the foreseeable future, and may remain locked until everyone mentioned in its pages has been dead for decades, and the specific institutional structures it describes have been so thoroughly reformed or replaced that revelation carries no contemporary risk. That could be another 20 years, or 50, or longer. The 100-year rule that normally governs Vatican archives would suggest the file should become accessible around 2057, a century after its creation. But the Riservato classification overrides that rule, and there's no automatic mechanism for review or declassification. The decision to release would require active choice by Vatican leadership, prompted either by external pressure, internal reform efforts, or a papal directive. None of those catalysts appear imminent. What this means for you, listening now in the darkness wherever you are, is that the history we've walked through tonight is as close as you'll get to understanding what RSV 1957-34 contains and why it matters. The file exists. We know its general contours through the fragments that have leaked into academic discourse and through the structure of Vatican financial reforms that were shaped by its absence, but the specific details, the names beyond initials, the exact financial mechanisms, the full extent of the irregularities, the complete internal debate about how to respond, remain locked in Strong Room 7, waiting for a future moment when the Vatican decides revelation serves its interests better than continued silence. And here we are, at the quiet end of this long night together. I hope you found something in this story worth your time, some piece of understanding about how institutions protect themselves and how silence gets engineered not through destruction but through careful preservation in places no one can reach. If this resonated with you, if you found yourself pulled into the specifics of catalog codes and strong rooms and the human decisions that built this architecture of secrecy, I'd be grateful if you take a moment to like this video. And if you want more of these stories, more nights where we walk through the concrete details of Vatican Mysteries and Vatican Secrets, consider subscribing to Tales of Vatican Secrets. We share new videos every day, each one focused on real documents, real decisions, real history. I'll be back tomorrow night with another story, but for now, rest well and thank you for listening.